Hello, I'm Yonit Levy of Channel 12 in Tel Aviv.
And I'm Jonathan Friedland of The Guardian in London.
And we are Unholy, two Jews on the news from Keshet Podcasts.
Hello, Yonit. How are you doing this week?
Hello, Jonathan. Well, it's an eventful week here in Israel. Big political achievement for the Bennett government. I'm going pretty heavy on the small talk, as you noticed. Almost 5 months after being sworn in, they managed to get a budget passed last night with a razor-thin majority. You and I used to say this coalition is so diverse they can't agree on lunch. Well, they agreed on an economic blueprint. So this is a pretty big deal.
This is why people want us as guests at their cocktail parties, Yonit, because you and I, this is our idea of opening, ice-breaking chit-chat to talk about the Israel budget. But you're on home ground
I'm
here.
a lot of fun in parties, Mr. Friedland, I'll have you know.
Both of us are your go-to guests because this is what we will bring to the festivities. No, but you're on home ground here because I'm interested in this because, as we've always said, people gave this. I mean, Netanyahu gave it, 5 minutes, and yet here they are reaching this milestone and getting a budget. And so, what's in it? Is there anything really striking in it?
Well, first of all, I mean, the key thing about the budget, I would say, is not whether it's a good one or a bad one, but the fact that there is a budget. And this is very important vis-a-vis this specific government. Well, we know this. We've talked about this. If the budget had not passed, the Knesset would automatically dissolve. We would be headed for new elections. Now this is signaling to all of the players in the political arena, there is indeed a government. It is not on shaky legs anymore. And Bennett is the prime minister. I would just say, to note a small paradox in this whole story, right? We still know that the glue holding this whole coalition together is, of course, Benjamin Netanyahu. The budget passing, the government now seemingly entrenched, means that this weakens Bibi. It might embolden his challengers in the Likud, thus eventually forcing him out. Once that happens, of course, the glue holding the government together weakens. But I think I've probably moved a little too forward in the future right now.
No, but also I think, people will remember that how agonizingly slow it was to get budgets through. Even when he had big coalitions, etc., it would go right to the wire. Sometimes a year would go by where there was no budget. And yet here, this goes to that idea that the new government is capable and sort of adults in the room and all of that. It helps them in that way. I mean, it's good that we're talking about Bennett because Bennett is on people's radar in quite a big way outside Israel this week. I mean, not always, a big figure, but he was around.
Yeah, I mean, this is all in all a pretty good week for the Israeli prime minister. All this is happening on the cusp of, Glasgow's COP26 summit, him meeting with world leaders, cozying up to world leaders. And, I would say he's probably living Netanyahu's dream, right? He's being there as the leader who dealt COVID a huge blow with the booster shots. This, for example, is what British Prime Minister Boris Johnson said of him this week to Christian Amanpour.
I had a very interesting conversation earlier on with Naftali Bennett of Israel. And it's that third jab gives you a huge amount of protection. And conversely, if you don't have it, then the protection starts to wane. And so even if you've had 2 jabs, I think people need to wake up to the fact that without the booster,
that's kind of
they are going to be less protected. And we need them to get the boosters in the way that they got their first 2.
So that was Boris Johnson about Israel's handling of the COVID crisis. But of course, COP26 is about the environment. So let's talk about that. I think it's interesting to note that on environmental issues, this is not something on the top agenda in Israel, right? I mean, this is a country that always seemed like it's a country under existential threat, doesn't have time to deal with these issues, supposedly, right? We don't have a coal mining industry. I think it's Golda Meir used to say that Moses took us to the only place in the Middle East that doesn't have oil. So it's never been such an issue or a debatable issue in this country. So Naftali Bennett could actually use that to score points on an issue that is not something that Israelis are at all, sort of, it's not a controversy in this country at all. It plays to his advantage.
No, I mean, that's interesting because the fact that it's not controversial in the way that it has been in the United States, for example, doesn't necessarily mean a country's going to act on it. It could just be that they just don't talk about it at all. They all agree it's a problem, but don't deal with it. I'm interested in this about, whether Israelis themselves have sort of got it on climate change and just environmental issues in general. I'm sitting here in London Borough of Hackney, where we separate out our rubbish every week into black bins and green bins, and food waste is a separate bin, and everyone's pretty on it, and there is a kind of stigma about driving an old vehicle that is high emissions, and people are very happy to virtue signal about cycling rather than getting the car and getting the train instead of the plane. It's just now sort of part of the culture. And my impression from a distance of Israeli life is it's not quite like that. I'm being polite.
I'm just thinking back to the number of times we were talking, like, I'm on my bike. I'm on my bicycle now. I'm cycling. So yes, to be.
Oh, that's the virtue signaling. You're upbraiding me for virtue signaling to you. It's true. I have done that. Just
a little bit. You noticed that, huh? I'll tell you what. Look, Israelis, I think generally, again, the collective state of mind is always that there's something more urgent, right? Again, we are a country that feels under existential threat, and if Iran, I don't want to sound flippant, but if Iran is going to throw a nuclear bomb at us, who cares about recycling, right? That is like the essential sort of state of mind. So Israel is a country in which recycling is considered a little bit of a luxury. Cars have doubled in the last decade. The public transport isn't exactly, let's say, efficient. So it's not an issue that I think Israelis have been dealing with in depth. There's a joke about how the ministry relevant to this used to be called the Ministry for the Quality of the Environment, Echut HaSviva, and at some point they had to change it to Defense or Protection of the Environment so that Israelis would take it seriously because they understand the word defense or protection, right? So now it's called Haganat HaSviva. So that would try to make an attempt to make them more interested in this topic. By the way, Naftali Bennett, again, driving this back to him, he's talking about things like making Israel like the clean tech or the green tech hub, right, of the world, taking what we know about startup and about high tech and turning that into our new brand. I don't know if he'll be successful. I have to say the discrepancy between saying this is a prime minister with a year and 8 months on the clock and his legacy regarding the environment is an interesting sort of gap, but that is what he's trying to do.
It does show great confidence for him to be making plans about 2050.
He was talking about zero emissions by 2050, which incidentally is when Netanyahu is coming back for his fourth tenure as prime minister. So, he's thinking ahead. He's thinking ahead.
Now, we did get into some of this at quite a high sort of policy level in our conversation with Ben Rhodes on the podcast last week. And that actually brought in a really interesting response from an old friend of mine, British-born, lives on Kibbutz Tuval in Israel. His name is Robbie Gringrass, and he's a writer and performer, but he said that actually he thought that we should not lose sight of the fact that because we talked about the role that religion might play and what voice there is in that. And he said, the non-Orthodox Jewish world, which is the vast majority in the United States, is all about the climate crisis. And he offered some really interesting examples in his letter. He said leading lights include Yossi Abramovich, who actually, I think I'm right in saying, is Sarah Silverman's brother-in-law. We're going to do a bit of Jewish geography here. He pushed for all the solar fields in the Negev and also has set them up throughout Africa. There's a Rabbi Julian Sinclair, who writes a lot about solar power and its links. Apparently the inventor of solar power was a Kabbalist and created the solar cell according to Kabbalah. And he mentions Nigel Savage, who set up a Chazon, a massive movement in the United States, which is the Jewish Lab for Sustainability. And he says, funnily enough, all three now live in Israel. And his point is that there is real overlap between Jewish thinking and Jewish values and the concern about the climate. The notion of Shemitah, resting the land, etc., is really in touch with the sharpest thinking on the environment. So, this is a discussion.
Tikkun
Thank you, Robbie,
olam in that sense, right?
Right. I mean, quite literal, physical repair of the world. And so thank you to Robbie for writing. And we do get responses.
I heard two things from that letter, by the way. One is Jews rock. Second is you have a connection to Sarah Silverman. That's what I took from all of you,
No, you are quite right, because I did know, we're going to do Jewish geography. I did know Yossi Abramovich when I lived in Washington, and that's all true. When Yossi Abramovich married Sarah Silverman's sister, Sarah Silverman, went on Saturday Night Live and said, so my, sister's getting married, and their children, they're going to be very egalitarian, so their children will be called, whatever, Abramovich Silverman, or in other words, Jew. Because what could be a more Jewish name than Abramovich Silverman? Anyway, he is a great pioneer in solar matters. And so, even if Israelis aren't doing all the recycling, there is a kind of Jewish take on the climate crisis.
Yeah, and I'm going to add in, because we were discussing the budget, that there's a tax in this budget introduced to reduce single-use consumption, right? Israel produces like twice the international average of plastic waste per person a day. So this is obviously going to change the equation, although it is also seen as something that is a move that hurts the ultra-Orthodox community. We'll put a pin in that, but we will in future, in a very close episode, discuss the situation between this coalition and the ultra-Orthodox, because that's a whole big mess that we should talk about.
But you've got to get onto the thing of the plastic, the double use of single-use plastic. Why Israel uses so much single-use plastic in terms of plates and cutlery and all the rest of it. Who's the group who are using it?
There is a large community of ultra-Orthodox in this country, more than 1 million. When you have 8 or 9 or 10 children, Jonathan, I just have 3, and I understand the lure of single-day plastic use, right? If you have that many children and a dishwasher is an issue because of kashrut, and an issue because it costs a lot of money, then you are bound to use a lot of these plastic plates and plastic utensils. By the way, the night of this tax actually becoming a law, you had long lines of ultra-Orthodox, waiting to buy this at half price before the price goes up. So yes, generally speaking, I'd say Israelis are not focused enough on this issue, but specifically when you have that big a population that uses this on a day-to-day basis, and those are the numbers you're going to get. I mean, and of course, most of it ends up in the beaches.
I can verify and corroborate the Haredi usage of single plastic and plastic plates and cutlery. I say no more about the bags of rubbish that I see on my street. I say no more, but just to verify, confirm, and corroborate every word you have said there. Now, the thing about these, I mentioned before that one of the interesting things about the summit was that, there was Israel doing something other than the conflict. And that was partly because Naftali Bennett was being asked about Israel's handling of COVID. But there was also, Israel sort of made the news, and British ministers here were talking about the Israeli delegation to the COP26 summit for other reasons.
Yeah, I mean, if we were giving out awards just for the Glasgow summit, I think the Karina Larar story, the story of the Minister of Energy in Israel, would get the organizers of the COP26 a Chutzpah award. I mean, right? Israel's minister who can't enter because she's in a wheelchair. So yeah, let's save the planet, but please don't do it from a wheelchair. I mean, how is it possible that this place is not wheelchair accessible?
I think this was hugely embarrassing for the hosts, actually. Just this story went around that there was the energy minister who could not get into the conference and had to go back to her hotel because she was disabled. And it was interesting, I thought, just because, there will be all these people in British progressive circles who would want to normally attack the government for not having full access to all delegates, but found themselves sort of hesitating because don't we kind of want to boycott Israel anyway, and maybe they shouldn't be at the summit. So how outraged can I get? I hate the Tories for barring people because of disability. On the other hand, I can't get that outraged that an Israeli wasn't allowed to take part. So I felt there was a bit of tongue-tied hesitancy among some of our friends on social media about this issue.
Who do you dislike more?
Yeah, who do we dislike exactly? But it was, the British ministers were hauled before BBC microphones to explain themselves and to say how they'd done it, and there was no good answer. I mean, it is embarrassing.
Right, and then the Prime Minister had to apologize. Boris Johnson had to apologize to her. If we are on the issue of, it's not our official chutzpah and mensch, but let's give a mensch award. If we're talking about the summit, let's give a mensch award to our favorite chancellor, Angela Merkel, who brought along her likely successor, Olaf Scholz, to the meetings, thus emphasizing continuity. Of course, he's from a rival party. I mean, he used to be part of the coalition, but still, I mean, just compare that to the 30-minute handover Netanyahu allocated Naftali Bennett, and you see that is quite a move on her part, I think.
It was quite sweet in a kind of take your successor to work day. It had that sort of vibe about it because she's been around so long and he's going to new. But I agree with you. There was something very civilized about letting him have some on-the-job experience.
Exactly. And we will. Spoiler alert: the succession word will come up later in our program as well.
Yes, exactly. For fans of Succession, stay with us. We have our very own take on that. All right, so that's COP26, which is a big deal and continues because the negotiators are still at work for, I think, at least another week. But I thought we should talk about events in what is Europe's biggest Jewish community, not here in Britain, but in France, where things have taken a really extraordinary turn, because every time a French presidential election looms, people worry always about the Le Pen factor. And it's, in 2002 and again last time, where a Le Pen, either the father Jean-Marie or the daughter Marine, is on the ballot, and, everyone who isn't a kind of nationalist or a fascist adjacent thinks, let's rally to defeat the Le Pen. Well, now there is a challenge to Le Pen from the right, an ultra-nationalist who has said things, I have to say, as offensive as the kinds of things you hear out of the Le Pen dynasty, except he is a Jew. And we are talking about Eric Zemmour, a French Jew of Algerian origin, who is, some people say, is a cross between Donald Trump and Tucker Carlson. He's a journalist. He's in his 60s, but he has a TV talk show in a kind of Tucker Carlson way. And he is being talked up as a potential presidential candidate. There is huge interest and sort of energy in the possibility that he might run. He had a book out in September. It immediately sold 100,000 copies in its first week. The title is France Has Not Yet Said Her Last Word. Ultranationalist, even Jean-Marie Le Pen himself, age 93, has said that he will back Zemmour. He's fallen out with his daughter. There's, it's not just Jewish families that have Broiguses.
Yeah, she's a bit too moderate for him. For his liking.
He says, Le Pen says, he says what I think. He's talking about Eric Zemmour. He says what I think, but to a larger audience. The only difference between Eric and me is that he is Jewish. It is difficult to call him a Nazi or a fascist. This gives him more freedom.
Yeah, this is just a remarkable and even mind-boggling story. I mean, first of all, the comparison to Trump, I would say he's a more sophisticated version of Trump, right? I mean, he's what my friend in Paris would call a superficial intellectual. He wrote history books. He was a columnist, a political pundit on television, as you said. He's Trump with the French idiosyncrasies, and that is important because when we're talking about a world in which we don't know which way the pendulum is swinging, right? Are we moving to populism or to pragmatism? You have this kind of populist 2.0 who's more refined, not in content than Marine Le Pen, but definitely in style. I think that's something to note. And of course, the main sort of twist here in all of this kind of twisted story is the fact that he is indeed Jewish. Now, it's amazing. I mean, the things that he is saying, right, that the Vichy regime actually protected French Jews, which is unbelievably offensive, right? We're 26 years after Jacques Chirac admitted France's complicity with the Nazis, acknowledging the nation's role in the deportation of Jews. He's saying that Alfred Dreyfus may not be innocent. This is a dog whistle and signaling to the far right. He's saying that French children, Jewish children killed in a terror attack in Toulouse are not properly French because they were buried in Israel. This is beyond offensive. And if it's anyone who wasn't Jewish, you would say without hesitancy that this is anti-Semitic. The fact that he is Jewish allows him, I think, sadly or tragically, to say these things and kind of get away with it, right? I mean, that is, I think, what is most appalling about him.
I agree completely. I mean, let's add him, by the way, to our list of journalists and TV personalities who must not be allowed anywhere near power. I know this is an enduring theme of ours. I mean, it is hard to choose. What is the most offensive of the things he has said? I mean, that defense of the Vichy regime and suggesting, oh no, they only wanted to deport foreign Jews, not French-born ones. And again, that's totally at odds with the facts. But this line on Dreyfus, as you mentioned, saying, we will never know if he was innocent or not. Right. I mean, what a thing I think that is to say. I was just going to say. Sorry, I was just going to say the thing about you mentioned about the children and their father killed in that terror attack in Toulouse. The actual words are so chilling. He says because they were buried in Israel, they were foreigners above all and wanted to stay that way even beyond death. I mean, that is so hideous as a thing to say about children who were, the little girl famously pulled by the hair and then killed. It is so appalling. And yet I think there are going to be people who think, well, somehow it's legit because he's Jewish. And there are French Jews who we know who are feeling very under pressure because of the rise in French anti-Semitism, who will rally to a message that, and this is Eric Zemmour's main message, of anti-Muslim French nationalism. And he's calling out French Muslims, and there are a constituency of French Jews, some saying particularly Algerian and Moroccan Jews, North African Jews like him, who are ready to hear that message. But I find it deeply chilling.
Yeah, but there is a group of course, many Jews who, I spoke to a friend who said, I don't speak a word of Hebrew, but the word I want to say is busha. I'm embarrassed that this man is making inroads in French politics. And again, we keep thinking. I think that the sort of rational part of our brain is saying, "Yeah, this can't happen, right? It's not going to happen in France, right? He doesn't have a political party yet. By the way, neither did Macron 5 years ago, and this can't happen." But we lived through 2016. We know that the inconceivable can become the inevitable. This man can become president, and I think that we need to point out, what he is saying, what he's standing for. By the way, I listened to many videos of his. He's very compelling. You're walking with this argument. He goes through history. You're like, okay, and then he says something terrible like we have to fight to the death against cancel culture, right? Or all million Arab Muslims hate France, live in France but hate France. All kinds of stuff that you are sort of appalled by. By the way, just to note. This never goes without, hand in hand, a television media mogul. In this case, Vincent Bolloré, who is the head of, I would call him the French Rupert Murdoch, or French Rupert Murdoch before the 2020 elections, right, who's supporting him. He has this sort of Fox News channel that backs him. He's also responsible for a lot of other publications and et cetera. So he's a very powerful man standing behind this. I would take this very, very seriously.
I agree, and I think two other reasons, one of which we've mentioned, why he might do much better than Jean-Marie Le Pen or Marine Le Pen. First of all, he's not called Le Pen, and I think part of that impulse that made everyone except the right unite to block the Le Pens was just a kind of reflex that there was a habit there. Oh, we know what to do. That when a Le Pen is on the ballot, everyone unites either behind Chirac or Macron. They do it. That is not going to be there this time. And second of all is the obvious one, which is it is harder, always harder, to brand a Jew a racist and anti-Semite. I know that the French chief rabbi has called him an anti-Semite, but it is harder when that person is Jewish. And to add to the list, Bernard-Henri Lévy, the big French Jewish intellectual, Zemmour calls him a traitor and a cosmopolitan. I mean, those are not dog whistles. Those are kind of foghorns, right? We know what he's saying. Those are old anti-Semitic tropes, and yet Zemmour is able to do it. I think there is zero room for complacency after we've seen what Trump can do. But he has some other cards to play that make him actually even stronger.
Yeah. So shall we lighten the mood with some infighting in New York among New York Jews?
Have you got a chutzpah award to dole out?
I always have a chutzpah award, Jonathan. You can wake me up in the middle of the night. I will have a chutzpah award for you or anyone else.
If I do that, I'll be on my bike and I'll be saying to you, I'm cycling, Yonit, and I wanted, just because I care about the environment, and I wanted you to come up with this week's Chutzpah Award nominee.
So this story really reads like, I would say an HBO drama, really. It's the story of the succession, New York's probably most famous, wealthy, important shul, the Park East Synagogue on the Upper East Side. Now, 91-year-old Arthur Schneier is the synagogue's senior rabbi who fired his very popular assistant, Rabbi Benjamin Goldschmidt. He's 34 years old. And he was, kind of generally seen as the would-be successor. The people who support the older rabbi say that Benjamin Goldschmidt basically tried to stage a coup d'etat and failed. Now, there's all kind of fishy money issues in this. Schneier serves as a full-time rabbi. He also draws salary from the foundation he runs. His son has been married 6 times. He's a sort of always on page 6 of the New York Post. This whole story is unbelievable drama on the way, and I think there's enough chutzpah to go around. It's the 34-year-old rabbi who couldn't wait and couldn't be patient. The 91-year-old rabbi who has no plans to either retire or say who his successor is, and you just kind of ask the question, so who is responsible here? The congregation, the board, the rabbi? It's a big mess, Jonathan.
So if Logan and Kendall Roy spoke Yiddish and were rabbis, this is what the story would be.
It's Logan Oy instead of Logan Roy, and you could do the whole story.
I really want to hear it. I want to have the soundtrack in with a sort of klezmer band playing.
I can tell you that David Beshevkin on Twitter cast the whole story as a Hollywood film. I'm not going to give it away because it's pretty amazing. Mila Kunis is there. That's all I'm going to say.
That is just too good. We, meanwhile, have to hand out a Mensch Award. And I think my nominee for this week will be students at George Washington University, and particularly of a fraternity there. It's not a Jewish fraternity, but they have Jewish members. And part of the ritual of initiation at the Tau Kappa Epsilon fraternity at GWU involved a replica, sort of toy version of a Sefer Torah, which they kept in the basement, the Torah scroll. Last week, the fraternity was attacked and vandalized by a gang of students who damaged the replica Sefer Torah and the Torah scroll and threw detergent over it and ruined it. I was about to say desecrated. That's part of the question here because it wasn't a real Sefer Torah, which, as we know, is a hugely sacred object in Judaism. It takes a year to hand inscribe every letter, and even slight damage renders it immediately unkosher. There's an argument going on at the university about whether or not this was an anti-Semitic attack or whether it was just random students randomly being drunken and violent. But it was noticed that a Christian Bible, a New Testament, so-called, in the fraternity basement was not damaged. And so, look, either way, I think the Mensch Award goes to students there who did react and marched in solidarity with the students at that fraternity and said that this was an attack to be condemned. And I think the reason why they get the Mensch Award is, even if, let's say it was just random vandalism and it wasn't a very deliberate attack on Jews, and that's an if, even if it wasn't, nevertheless, the solidarity they showed with Jewish students and suggesting that they understood why this would make Jewish students feel, under siege a bit, and also the Jewish students there who just took it seriously and thought that, you don't go around behaving this way. I think that's worthy of note.
See, this is why you do the Mensch. You're so good at it. It's such a good nominee.
No, we're not gonna get into any fixed roles on this. It will be Chutzpah me next time. I know, I promise.
Maybe exaggerated my complaint last time. So we are winding up our discussion. Jonathan, I will have you know that Israel now accepts tourists who have been vaccinated. So no excuses. Just saying.
No excuses at all. It will happen. It will happen imminently. And then we will be face to face across a single microphone. I look forward
and then,
to that
like
moment.
a Jewish mother that you are, you must add, you can tell me again that I don't eat enough. We can go through the whole thing again. So we shall meet next week, and we shall give our thank yous to Lior Friedman, our executive producer, Rom Atik, head of podcasts, Omer Primat, and Irat Eshel for original music.
And we are grateful to all of you who've been giving us very high 5-star review ratings on the various platforms. Do write a review if you can, partly just because we do love to see what you think, and that will be great. And recommend us to your friends.
And we'll see each other next week.
See you, Yoni.